Okay, today we're going to go through the urinary system, both the basic anatomy and the physiology. Make sure you're looking at the objectives for what you need to know, and you may have a quiz for this video. It just depends on what class you're in, so make sure you complete that. You'll see this information on the final exam. All right, purposes of the urinary system. We're going to control the ions that we've been talking about all semester. We talked about electrolytes and Gatorade and action potentials. So this is the system that's going to regulate those ions. It's also going to regulate blood pressure by regulating water. We talked about this with the cardiovascular system. Remember, there was even a question on the test. I said, what system or what organs of the body control or most control water volume? And that was the kidneys. And it's also going to maintain blood pH. We may or may not go over this. It just depends on time and what class you're in, but it maintains your acid-base balance of your blood. It also retains glucose and amino acids. It secretes EPO, which you should remember is necessary for the production of red blood cells. And it's going to eliminate waste products like urea. It's going to dissolve the urea and you will urinate that out. That comes from the breakdown of proteins, amino acids, and so on. Okay, we're going to go through the anatomy. How many urinary system has two of what? We'll do this on the next slide. You can always come back and look at it. You have two kidneys. You can live with one. When you do a live donation, which you can do since you can live with one, the person that's getting the donation, actually they will keep both their kidneys in there and actually put the new kidney in. So in there are nephrons, which we'll talk about, where blood is going to be filtered. Whatever's left over becomes urine, and that's going to travel down the ureters through peristalsis into the bladder and then out the body through the urethra. Some facts about the kidneys: they're located somewhat below the rib cage. This is why a lot of times you'll see football players below their shoulder pads will have another pad. That's going to help protect those kidneys. They're protected by fat and they're connected to the local structures by just connective tissue called fascia. Like I said earlier, you can live with just one kidney. The nephron is actually the functional unit of the kidney. This is where the blood is going to be filtered. And so we're going to have a lot of movement between the blood and the filtrate, which is in the nephron. Functional unit, you've got 1.3 million. I won't ask you that number. So let's look at the anatomy of the nephron. The first area is the renal corpuscle. The renal corpuscle is made of partly nephron and partly blood. The Bowman's capsule is right here, and that is part of the nephron. The glomerulus is made of leaky capillaries, and in these leaky capillaries, things are going to filtrate out into that Bowman's capsule. So this will be the first place where the blood and the nephron, things will move back and forth as we start to filter the blood. So again, the whole structure is the renal corpuscle. Next, we have the proximal convoluted tubule. Think of convoluted as curvy. That's the proximal convoluted tubule. The loop of Henle. The loop of Henle is involved with water control, which we'll get into a little bit. Then you have the distal convoluted tubule, and then the collecting duct. In this collecting duct, other nephrons will also be dropping the filtrate or secreting the filtrate into the collecting duct. Whatever's in there then is what becomes urine and travels out through the ureters. Okay, this is a very simple drawing of a nephron. So this is the renal corpuscle with the glomerulus here, the blood, and the Bowman's capsule. You have the proximal convoluted tubule, you have the loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting duct. Now this is not completely accurate. The distal convoluted tubule would actually come over here, but I just use this to show you the basics of how things are going to move back and forth between the blood. So you'll see along this nephron there is a blood supply here. Things are going to be moving back and forth between the filtrate and the blood throughout the whole nephron. So filtrate, when I use that word, that means the stuff that's in the nephron, and blood, shockingly, is the stuff that's in blood vessels. We've talked about blood extensively. So we're going to take a ride through a nephron, but before we do that, we need to talk about the ways, the methods that things can move back and forth between the filtrate and the blood. Filtration. Filtration is only going to happen in the renal corpuscle. And the best example I can give you is if you think about if you're going to make noodles, okay, you're going to make spaghetti for dinner, and you put the spaghetti in the pot, and you put water in there, and you throw some salt in there to keep them from sticking to each other. All right, think of that kind of as the blood. And then you got your colander. So when your noodles are done, you're going to throw the noodles into the colander, and that's going to be like filtration. Small things can fit through that colander, like the water and like the salt, but other things like the noodles cannot fit through, okay, cannot fit through. So that's filtration. There's pressure there, small things will move through, and large things will not. The next two, you need to make sure that you do not get confused. Tubular reabsorption is the movement of substances from the filtrate into the blood, okay, from the filtrate into the blood. Tubular secretion is when things go from the blood to the filtrate, so they're opposite directions. Tubular reabsorption, we're going to go from the filtrate to the blood. Tubular secretion, from the blood into the filtrate. Okay, so make sure you get those two, I'm going to write those down, and make sure you don't get them mixed up. All right, in the renal corpuscle, here we have the Bowman's capsule of the nephron and the glomerulus blood supply. Interesting blood supply. There's an arterial that goes in, and then there's leaky capillaries, and then there's an arterial that comes out. So that's different than anatomy of blood vessels. We always talked about going arterial, then capillary, then venule. In this case, you have arterial, capillary, then another arterial. Okay, so what's going to happen is, like I talked about with the colander, we're going to move any substance that can fit in the blood is going to leave the glomerulus and go into Bowman's capsule. This includes water. This controls ions. Anything that is small enough to move. Things that shouldn't move are going to be larger proteins. Okay. Glucose is small enough to move, so all the glucose is going to move out initially in this renal corpuscle. Like I said, water, ions, glucose. But protein should not move, blood cells should not move. What can happen to people with high blood pressure over time is, since these capillaries are very weak and thin, if someone has chronic high blood pressure, it can start to break down this glomerulus. And what can happen is then substances that shouldn't move, remember the noodles in the colander didn't move, but if you broke that colander down and made the holes bigger, the noodles would start to move. So with someone with chronic hypertension, what can happen is things like blood cells and proteins can start to get into the filtrate, and that's not a good thing. So filtration only occurs at the renal corpuscle. Okay. Most stuff, anything that fits, is going to work, or is going to move, I should say. Now, let me just show you this, a simple drawing. So here we have filtration. What's going to happen is water's going to move, glucose is going to move, ions is going to move, almost everything that fits is going to move. So just to give you an idea, okay, you produce 180 liters of filtrate every day for adding up all the nephrons at the renal corpuscle, okay, at the renal corpuscle. But you only produce 1 to 2 liters of urine. So let me show you this. So most of the filtrate that's produced at the renal corpuscle is going to be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. Okay. So here's this example again. Filtrate it out. You make about 180 liters. If you made that much urine in a day, you'd be peeing constantly. We'd have to have a catheter because you couldn't make it through a class. So what happens is, through the rest of the nephron, we're going to bring a lot of stuff back into the blood. So by the end of the day, you make about 1 to 2 liters of urine. Okay. Now, you don't make 180 liters at one nephron. This is representing all the nephrons throughout the kidneys. Okay, so how are we going to move it back? We're going to use things like diffusion, active transport. We're going to move things from the filtrate back to the blood. Okay? And osmosis will follow this stuff. I'll show you a picture in a second. By the time we get through the proximal convoluted tubule, 65% of what was made, or filtrate that was made at the renal corpuscle, is reabsorbed back into the proximal convoluted tubule. Okay, so let me show you this. So imagine there's little proteins here moving glucose back, moving ions back, moving all this stuff back into the blood. By the rules of osmosis, water is going to follow the stuff. So you're going to reabsorb a lot of water back into the bloodstream at the proximal convoluted tubule. Whatever goes back like ions is reabsorbed like ions and glucose, water will follow it. In a healthy individual with normal glucose levels, there should be no glucose in the urine by the time we finish, so it should all be reabsorbed at the proximal convoluted tubule, and water should follow it, okay? And water should follow it. Now, if someone is diabetic, just as a side note, if someone's diabetic and has high blood sugar, what happens is only so much glucose can be moved back in this proximal convoluted tubule. If a person's glucose level is really high, what happens is there still ends up being glucose in the filtrate after it passes the proximal convoluted tubule. The side effect of that is that if glucose stays in the filtrate, then so will water. And so one of the symptoms of someone being diabetic is they urinate a lot. And that is because the water is going to stay with the glucose in the filtrate. Remember, in a healthy individual, the glucose will all go back into the blood and water will follow it as it should. The loop of Henle is going to allow for efficient reabsorption of water and ions. What it's going to do, all you need to know is that it's going to set up a situation in the distal convoluted tubule where water, if we need to, that water can move back into the blood to maintain homeostasis. In the proximal convoluted tubule, this area cannot be controlled by hormones. Water content in your blood cannot be fine-tuned. It just goes with the stuff. If the stuff goes, the water goes with it. Down at this end, we're going to be able to control the water content of the blood. We're concerned about maintaining homeostasis within the blood. So what you have is a hypotonic situation and a hypertonic. So if we need to, only if we need to, we can move water back into the bloodstream if the water content in the bloodstream is low. And we'll get into that. It's controlled by hormones. We'll get into that in the next video. So that's all you need to know about the loop of Henle. It just sets up a situation where we can move water if we need to in the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, so if the filtrate is hypotonic, which way can water move? If we needed to, we can move water back from the filtrate into the blood if we need to, if the water in the blood is low. And that will be controlled by a hormone, ADH, which we'll talk about in the next video. All right, what happens in the distal convoluted tubule? We're going to move things back and forth. And again, we don't want to go into great detail. The distal convoluted tubule is going to allow us to fine-tune the water content of the blood using what's called the antidiuretic hormone, which again, we'll talk about that later. We're going to talk about potassium also later. Tubular secretion happens here. So secretion, remember, is going from the blood into the filtrate. Okay, the blood to the filtrate is tubular secretion. So when your body wants to get rid of urea and get rid of things, it's going to secrete it, okay, from the blood into the filtrate, and then it'll go out the urine. With drug testing, what happens when you take certain drugs? The drug breaks down, and what's going to happen is the blood is going to secrete those drug breakdowns into the filtrate, which will then be part of the urine. And if you take a drug test with a urine sample, they're testing for the breakdown of those drugs. A pregnancy test is based on the same concept. A developing embryo will secrete something called HCG. HCG will be in the bloodstream, will be secreted from the blood into the filtrate, and then you pee on the stick and it's looking for that HCG or the breakdown of that HCG. Makes a pregnancy test positive or negative if there is no HCG. Okay, so what happens here is we're really fine-tuning the contents of the blood. Remember, we are concerned about what's in the blood. The filtrate is just going to be what we're going to get rid of. So these are going to represent tubular secretion. We're going to regulate water content and ion content in this area using hormones, which we'll talk about in the next video. All right, urine transport. It's then going to go, you don't need to really know minor or major calyx. So here's the nephrons in here. It's going to dump into collecting ducts, which are going to dump into this area and then head down, okay, in the renal pelvis, which again, I'm not going to ask that you know, but that just so you know that's right there. It's going to go through the ureters, through peristalsis, which is the same way smooth muscle contraction, food move through the food move through the digestive system using the same process. It's just smooth muscle contraction. Okay. Go from the ureters into the bladder. Okay. When about 200 milliliters of urine accumulates, you'll get a signal from there and your brain will say, hey, you got to go pee. One thing about this, unlike going poop, you can actually kind of ignore this signal initially and the sensation will go away. It will then come back. You don't want to keep doing that too long, but it's different than defecation or pooping where when you got to poop, you got to poop. But when you got to pee, you can usually not think about it or stop thinking about it and the sensation will go away. Okay, so you got two sphincters. The technical word for peeing is micturition. You've got an internal and external sphincter similar to the digestive system. What'll happen is when you relax that external sphincter, then you'll pee. Okay, so what you do when you're potty training a baby is you're teaching them how to control their external sphincter. Who would have known? Okay, so that's the end of the basics of the urinary system. Make sure you understand everything. Make sure you can answer the objectives. And like I said, depending on your class, you will have a video. They will have not a video, a quiz that you will need to take just to make sure you're understanding everything.